Namaste and welcome to Josh. He's the founder and host of the very moving and insightful podcast, The Emerald. And all
Mm.
of you who, if you've had a chance to look at it, I'm sure you've gone through all the episodes. My favorite is the goddess episode and everything connected to it, Josh. Thank you so much for
Mm.
all the time you take, and very clearly a lot of effort goes into the production. Thank you so
Mm.
much for that.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and discussing some of my favorite topics.
Thank you. Yesterday, in my Carnatic music class, Josh, the teacher was we were learning the Pancharatna Kritis, which are the grand compositions of one of India's great composers, and
Mm.
she was talking about two ragas and how just one note, the madhyama of Bhairavi, which is so grand and invokes so much of excitement, gets totally transformed if we do not sing the ma or the ma properly, and it
Mm.
becomes mukhari, and it becomes a raga of pathos and sorrow, and usually sung in funerals.
Mm.
So why I'm talking about this is, if we do not have a guru who can tell us this, what is the right note, we could go wrong in something very fundamental, even though we are a earnest student. So
Mm.
in your life, in the context of the work that you do, who
Mm.
are your teachers who have set you on the path, and what are the things that have influenced you in your storytelling?
Mm. Thank you, and it's a testament to the strength of the teacher in the Indian traditions that this is the first question that you ask,
Mhm.
and it's wonderful to hear this question and to get to respond to it a little bit. So I've lived a varied life and I've studied in various traditions. And I can't say that I've been like the perfect student, first of all, right off the bat. Um,
Mhm.
I was raised in a Buddhist family, in a Buddhist tradition. My parents converted to Zen Buddhism when I was very, very young. And so I was raised within that lineage, and the carrier of that lineage was a man named Roshi Philip Kapleau, who had brought Buddhism over from Japan to the West and wrote a book called The Three Pillars of Zen, which was very popular at a certain point. And that, for me, that was the first 10, 11 years of my life, and then actually a little past that too. And it was like really immersed and really steeped in tradition and in structured practice and in story, myth and story. And the combination of those things, I think, gave me a reverence and a respect for, what it is to study, but not just to study over here and over there and over and this way and that way, but to actually, dedicate oneself to a lineage and feel the power of the transmission of a lineage. And it also provided for me an environment in which, as a child, the stories that I heard, that I was exposed to, I think for many of the adults coming from Western culture, they kind of took the stories as like cute little anecdotes, maybe. But for me, the stories were alive. They were vibrant. And when they were speaking of gods and goddesses and talking animals and nature spirits and these types of things, I really took that to heart. I didn't feel it as like a fiction. I felt it as a truth. So, that was like the first kind of lineage tradition that I was exposed to. And then when I was 13 years old, we went to India for the first time. And this was a long time ago. Reveal a little bit about my age, but this was 1983. Um, and we stayed in Tiruvannamalai at Sri Ramana Maharshi's ashram. And I was 13 years old and exposed to the Indian myths and stories and practices for the first time at that time. And at that critical juncture in my life, which is really a moment between childhood and adolescence, to encounter the Indian traditions and the living mythology of India. Mythology not as an abstract, but mythology as embedded in the actual practice of day-to-day life. It really opened my eyes and my heart and changed the course of my entire life. And I've been going back to India ever since. So we stayed at the ashram at that time when I was a boy, and I have very vivid memories of that. And um, the simple taking of meals every day, and the morning prayers and the evening prayers. And I've been going back to Tiruvannamalai ever since, and going to the ashram there ever since. And it's a place that I hold really, really dear in my heart. I know actually that they've just been through some flooding there, and my heart is sending them good wishes. During that time in India in 1983, we encountered His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Bodh Gaya. Um, and this was a time before he was a popular international celebrity. This was way back when. And that made a very deep impression on me. And that was really my first introduction to Tantra. So my first introduction to Tantra was on the Buddhist side. And I studied in the Karmakargyu lineage all throughout my high school years. And, it formed um, the like real backbone of my tantric study. Later on, I became much more interested in Indian Tantra, in Hindu Tantra. And this was for many reasons. But in me, I think there's always been uh, I valued very much the Buddhism of my upbringing, but there was a a, a bhava and a bhakti that wasn't being met through those traditions, that really could find no other home other than the more theistic traditions. And so, yeah, I encountered Hindu Tantra much later as I began to study yoga asana on a more serious level, and came back to India. Much later on. There's a lot more history I could get into. But I don't think I'll get into that right now because it's a long story. But studied in Mysore, and studied with a wonderful teacher, Sri Narasimhan, and Jayashri in Mysore, and started at that time really gravitating towards and investigating the goddess traditions. And I did this at first without any real formal study. I just knew that I felt something at goddess temples, and it called to me, and I wanted to know more. So I started really prioritizing when I would come to India. I started prioritizing going to the Shakti Peeth temples and exploring the Shakti Peeth temples. And, from very small village temples to the grand temples like Ambaji and these types of places, Kamakya Devi. And, with this, I started to be more exposed to goddess Tantra and the works of Stanisław Tymalsina, and also Mark Diskowski, the Western tantric teacher who lives in Varanasi. And they formed some of my introduction to the goddess lineages. And but it's been kind of it's a modern story. I haven't grown up in one particular lineage, but I've also studied. I've followed the call of the goddess traditions and seen what doors they opened, and continue to, when I visit India, to prioritize going to the Shakti Peeths and studying. And yeah, so I hope that's not too long of an answer.
No,
But
it's really wonderful, and I think we have something in common because I'm a student of Sthaneshwarji, and
wonderful. Yeah.
so today is also Geeta Jayanti, Josh. So I would
Mm,
like to ask one question based
mm,
on a course which Sthaneshwarji has recently concluded on the
mm,
Bhagavad Gita.
mm,
And he within the storytelling tradition, he says that it's the story is not just about Krishna talking to Arjuna,
Mm,
nor is it necessarily a story, a didactic story for us to learn something about a value based story. So within
mm,
this is a story. There are four tiers to this story. We have the original narrator being Vyasa, and he tells it to Varshampayana, and then you have his disciple overhearing it, and then you have Sanjaya telling it to the Dhritarashtra. So in this context, Staneshwar ji says in the Indian context, we have to rely on Shruti and Smriti. Finally, so
mm,
these would be our two go-to storytelling or fundamental truth uh, sources.
mm,
So, and a lot of people are not very comfortable with the word myth or mythology used for Indian stories. They prefer itihasa or memory,
mm.
which can change over time. So, in your opinion, is this something that is unique to India, or and how do we fit myth and storytelling into this, where in the Vedas we are told, we're not told that this is what you should do, but we are indirectly told this is what ought to be done.
Mm.
So how does myth fit into either Shruti or Smriti? And it seems to be a combination of Shruti and Smriti, where the rituals are part of one and the storytelling is part of another.
Yeah, this is a very beautiful question, and I'm happy with these questions because they're very different than questions that I normally get in the in the um, American podcast world. And first off, I defer completely to Acharyaji Staniswar Vasina. Um, I'm not an expert or a scholar anywhere near his level, so all I can really do is speak to the heart of what I've studied and the heart of what I know. It's interesting what you're bringing up because in English, the word myth or mythology has two different meanings, right? Um, mythology is like the body of story that exists within deep and ancient cultural tradition. And then in English, when we say, "Oh, that's just a myth," right, we mean something that's not true. Um, Very different than itihasa, very different than the understanding in Sanskrit that this is the way it is and the way it was, really. To me, I find like there's always a balance in how to approach these things. I think, for example, for Western minds, it's really good to allow ourselves to play in the space where myth is not just allegory, where myth is not just representing something else, where myth is actually invoking deep and ancient truths and is absolutely 100% positively real. This grinds against a lot of postmodern Western thinking. And I think that space, and this was another part of what was really powerful for me, encountering Indian tradition at age 13, at a time when a lot of, you know, a lot of my ways of thinking hadn't been set yet. And so the multi-perspectival thinking that exists within Indian tradition, I think, was able to really go to work on me and help me be able to hold kind of the beautiful paradox of myth, in that it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be simultaneously both. It can be smriti and shruti at the same time. We can hold that, the seers of the Vedas, we can hold those stories as living realities. And we can also hold um, that at some point those rishis heard something and they heard a sound and they sang along to it as best they could. And in singing along to it as best they could, they brought forth the truth of the Vedas. So to me, it's like, so it is. Yes, myth is so it is, so it is this way. And myth also leaves room and openness for that mysterious space, that space of the gods, you could say, that spontaneous space that, you know, leaves it a little bit more of a mystery. I don't know if that's getting at the heart of what you're speaking of, but
Yeah, yeah, that's one part. The other part is about this multi-tier, like you mentioned in your podcast on myths about PhD dissertation being rejected because it simplifies the structure of a story,
mm,
of stories in a graphic way.
mm.
So can we actually simplify something that is real, Josh?
Can we simplify something that is?
Like can we give a structure to storytelling when the stories are not fictional and
Mm,
are actually always eternally evolving?
mm,
They're not fixed in time. Our interpretation gives it a new life.
mm.
So would is it possible to give a kind of structure to something that's constantly evolving?
Yeah, I think that when we understand that it evolves in pattern, then it becomes possible to give it a structure. So Prakriti or Shakti, the dynamic vibrational force of the cosmos, unfolds and unfurls and evolves, and is continually shifting and adapting and changing, but also does so according to, what you could call like fairly predictable patterns in certain ways. So the great mystery unfolds. The great mystery is a mystery, but the great mystery also, unfolds according to pattern. And this is interesting just in terms of like Shakti worship on the Indian subcontinent. You can see the Divine Mother adapting and changing. And I mentioned in, an episode recently on religious syncretism, I mentioned how there are new goddesses in Andhra Pradesh. There's a new goddess that came into being just a few years ago and became very popular. And, new aspects of Shakti, when you consider the tantric explosion of the number of goddesses and dakinis and matrikas that are talked about in the tantras that weren't necessarily being invoked before. You can see that, like the force of life itself, Prakriti Shakti is ever adaptive. But in that ever adaptive nature, she is always still Ma, you know that's one of the
Hmm.
beautiful things about going to the local temples, where the names of the goddess differ. Right? It's Chintapurni here, it's Jwalamukhi here. It's like the names of the places goddesses differ, and they all have their local quality. They all have their pattern, their particular pattern, their confluence of ecology and their communal representation. But then also they're all Ma at the same time. Like they are Ma too. Ma, um, to get it kind of, I think, the mystic heart of your question, Ma is both transcendent and immanent. The texts describe her, many of the texts describe her as both transcendent and immanent. And this, to really understand what this means, that, she is the substrate of all vibrational reality. And as such is beyond our reckoning, beyond space and time, so utterly mysterious. And at the same time, she is immediately touchable, tangible, relatable to, and the forms through which we relate to her change and morph and adapt, but the heart to which those forms point, that's eternal.
Okay, that's lovely. Actually, in a podcast by Christopher Wallace, he explains this with painting description, and he says um, canvas, the original canvas, in one painting he describes, everything else is painted upon except for the moon, and the moon has the quality of the original canvas, which is the mother.
Hmm. Beautiful. Yeah.
So the mother is the entire canvas upon which things are worked upon or happen.
Yeah. And Timalsina ji has that beautiful commentary on, I think it's on the Sadashi Karnava, where he's speaking about how the Spanda Shakti of the goddess stirs, and having no canvas to paint upon, she paints upon the canvas of her own being, like a spider drawing its web out of her own body, right? So she is both the the primal consciousness of creation in its formless state, and the stirring and reflection, the vimarsha of that consciousness as it starts to stir into being, and then the diverse expression of that mystery into tangible form as well. She's all this, and this is reflected in her traditions, and it's reflected in her many names. And this is why, like, beautiful paradoxes, quote unquote paradoxes, that aren't paradoxes at all, but in the Lalita Sahasranama, you can have in one sentence, she's being described as, she is fullness, she is Purnam, she, in the very next one, she is Shunyata, she is emptiness.
Yeah.
How can she be all these things, right? Because she's the vibrational substrate of existence itself.
Absolutely. In a lot of episodes, Josh, there's a little tone of wistfulness, as if you want things to be different. Clearly, we all want things to be different, and but there are certain customs in India which are not really very loud, or which are not advertised as being a very community ritual. A very simple basic one is our worship of the sun, the Sandhya Vandanam, which we do three times a day. And if I'll just read, we take a sankalpa, and this is done at the start of every ritual, and we recite the place where we are from, Jambudvipe, in the Isle of the Rose Apple, Bharatavarshe, the region called Bharatavarsha, Bharatakande, in the continent of Bharata, and no ritual starts without this, without stating the precise time, the star, the date, the tithi, the fortnight, the month, the season, the half year, and the year on the micro side.
Mm.
When you do your podcast, are your listeners aware that this is done on a daily basis by thousands of people, three times a day, and
Mm.
it just takes 10 minutes. So when we talk about the festivals, that's something that anybody can participate in. But do people know that? I'm sure there are other traditions all over the world where these very private practices are not necessarily well known.
Mm. Yeah, I think that I hope I haven't directly mentioned this specific practice on the podcast before, but what I try to convey to listeners is the the importance in tradition after tradition after tradition after tradition, in the simple orientations that come through the exact type of practice that you're talking about, simply orienting ourselves to the larger cosmos where we sit within time and space. This type of orientation, which I feel in the postmodern world, that minds have gotten extremely fragmented, and people's sense of like who they are and where they exist within space has gotten lost in many ways. And so within that, like, I spoke to a Native American elder named Jose Barrero just a few episodes ago, and he talked about a practice that's very common in Native American traditions, and it's the simple offering of a daily gratitude, the simple expression, waking up, acknowledging the east, acknowledging the west, the south, the north, like locating where we are in space, and then acknowledging our relationality to all the living forces around us. Something like this, in the West, I think there's kind of a vision that, like, to reclaim some of this type of practice, it has to be grand and it has to be big and all this kind of thing. and really what is going to ultimately be, I think, of the best service to the to the postmodern soul is the simplicity of exactly what you're talking about. A simple daily practice that connects us to where we are in time and space, and connects us to the living forces around us. And these are the types of practices that I do, and I'm teaching my kids to do too. Very simple practices, um, you know, and the simplicity of those practices, that holds their power. We need that, that type of reorientation. Now, as far as like a kind of deep wistfulness, that's a that's a um, that's a beautiful reflection. And I let's put it this way. Um, I've been I haven't been to India since 2022 at this point, which has been a couple of years. I'm waiting for my kids to get a little older before we all go as a family. They haven't been there yet. Um, and I've just been telling my wife in the past several months how much I miss India. And what I really miss is really exactly what you're talking about. I miss being and then of course it depends on where you go in India these days, because there are plenty of fairly secular places within India too.
Yeah.
But I miss being immersed in a sacred rhythm every day, like waking up and knowing that they're chanting at the ashram right now, and hearing the sounds of the chants, and going to the temple every morning and offering every morning. And this type of rhythm, for those who have done it, like there's nothing else that replaces it. And I can do my little practices on my own, but it's very different. The you know the shakti, the energy that builds around communities and places where this is just like the way it is over and over and over again every day. It's hard for people in the Western world to even have a grasp of what that feels like and what that looks like. Um, and it's one of the things that I miss the most. The wistfulness, I think, in me comes from, you know, wanting um, there to be uh, a devotional substrate to life that is palpable and tangible and there all the time. And I feel it when I come to India, and I can immerse in it quite quickly, and have a lot of friends there who will welcome me with open arms into that type of rhythm. But as much as I try to replicate it in the Western world, I don't feel it quite as strongly over here. And and that's a big part of the reason why people are coming, to love the podcast. And it's missing in the Western world, and people are longing for it, and people want that type of connection. And yeah, so
It's missing in India too.
yeah.
Large part of India is losing it too. So
And I've seen that over the last 15 years of traveling to India. Even the difference between like 2010 and now, it's like very, very palpable. I went there first in 1983. I went there second in 1989. When I went there first in 1983, there was still like no foreign companies or entities in India at all. It was in the be Indian, buy Indian phase. Um, you know, it was before plastic had made its way to India. So like, all the chai was still served in the clay cups, and all the food you would get in the train stations was still served on leaves and everything. To see what plastic has done, in India, even in the past like 20 years, there's tremendous changes. There's tremendous positive changes too. There's like the development has brought a standard of living to a lot of people that, they didn't have before. But part of the, modernization, secularization, a lot of what's happening is a loss of, that regular rhythmic access to the sacred. And that makes me want to, cry out at, the top of my lungs, like, don't lose that. You don't know how precious it is. Like, really, it's, if you go to countries where they don't have that, the Western world is reeling from it. And It's one of the precious things that India has to offer, I think, is, the depth of tradition that, it's so deep and so profound and is so embedded and ingrained in so many communities. And I hope it is never lost.
I hope so. Thank you. Um, The one thing about the podcast, Josh, which is very, very attractive, is the aesthetics. The music is
Mm,
just so beautifully put. And, this, especially in the goddess episode, the choice of the Kriti was so spot on.
mm,
So, it was somebody in India, because to get the Shastras, quote the Shastras or quote the spiritual text, it's easier to research. But to
mm,
choose one Kriti from the Carnatic repertoire,
mm,
which represents the goddess, is
mm,
very difficult, because you have so many Kritis which are equally moving. But
mm,
the Bhairavi Swarajati was
mm,
just so beautiful.
mm.
This question is about aesthetics, and Abhinava Gupta seems to see beauty in every aspect of life, and it is the aesthetics to him was the means to ultimate divinity.
Mm.
Bharthari says that those devoid of literature, music, and arts are verily animals without horns and tail. And even contemporary stalwarts like Ravindra Sharma describes civilization as the Saundarya Drishti. So, in this context,
Describes
what are
it
your
as what?
thoughts?
Say that last
Saundarya
part.
Drishti, Drishti.
Yeah.
So, that would be an aesthetic vision.
Right. Yeah.
For them, without aesthetics, nothing seems of any real value.
Mm.
So, what are your thoughts on the aesthetics of the mythology narrative world in a contemporary context? Given your choice of music, the shabda, the words, the voice, use of your voice, how do you create that sense of aesthetics which is so uniquely yours?
I think that something that Abhinavagupta was well aware of, is that, the tantric traditions operate entirely through what can be called transmission, right? That And there's the transmission that happens between the teacher and the student, the transmission that happens within the ritual context. And then there's what you could call, I think, a larger understanding of, the basic energetic experience of being a human being, and what stirs us and what moves us and what draws us to, you know, long for cosmic union, and what moves us into, loving states of consciousness, and what creates the transformation in or starts at least the spark of transformation within our hearts. you know all of this happens through the living vibrational movement of energy. So if I have a podcast, and there are plenty of good conversational podcasts out there, but if I have a podcast and I just kind of talk about something, that's very different than finding the aesthetic within voice and within tone and within rhythm and tempo and cadence. um the gods are clothed in poetic meter, say the Vedas, right? The very gods are clothed in poetic meter. If you want to invoke the gods, you use poetic meter, because she is known through her adornments. The goddess is known through her adornments. Indian tradition is so beautifully adorned, right? And that adornment allows for the transmission of Shakti. It allows for the transmission of actual energy that might stir an emotion or a mood and move something. In the West, things have gotten incredibly analytical, and people will talk about myth and, well, this means this and this means this and this means that. And I just recently reacquainted myself with again, with the story of the churning of the cosmic ocean, from the actual full text of the Mahabharata. And in that full text of the Mahabharata, it's talking about how all of the the fragrant flowering trees on the slopes of the mountain, and the sandalwood trees on the slopes of the mountain, that they all get kind of crushed with this churning, and fragrance fills the air, and like the
Mm.
medicinal sap from the trees starts pouring down the sides of the mountain and mixing with the ocean and creating this like ghee. Like all of this
Mm.
is, it's an energetic aesthetic that's designed to move something in us. When we hear it, it's designed to stir the moods of consciousness. And then the bhakti traditions understand this too, just as the tantric traditions understand this, that like the experience of the divine, the experience of Shakti, the experience of the potency and power of the universe. It's an aesthetic experience. It moves through dance and art and sound and pattern, and the temple is constructed like the human body, so that when we cross the threshold into the temple, we're crossing, into our very own bodies and into the cosmic body at once. And as we approach the sanctum sanctorium at the center of the temple, and have that moment of darshan, that glimpse is like glimpsing in the, like staring into the bright heart of the universe, right? She is known and felt through moods. She is known and felt through the stirrings of vibrational energy. The last thing I want to put forth is kind of a dry analytical vision of myth, because this isn't the heart of what it is. It's all meant to move us. The music is meant to move us. The tone is meant to move us. The like the bhakti texts within India are meant to be sung. They're meant to be,
Mm.
sung and danced to. And you miss something very, very essential if you strip all that away and you say that, oh, well, the real meaning of these things is just in the kind of analytical essence of it. No, the rasa, the essence is the rasa, like the rasa, the juice, the sap, like it's
Mm.
delivered through sensual expression. It's delivered through sound. It's delivered through tone. It's delivered through cadence. Yeah. Um, yeah. So for me, the artistic aspect of it is incredibly important. And, how is she known? She's known through the postures of traditional dance, right? She's known through the songs that sing of her, right? She's known through the varying poetic meters, right? She's known through the different tonalities in which those meters are expressed. The goddess is the mantra, right?
Mm.
So if you want to convey um, or help create a mood, like just as Tulsi Devi sets the mood for the divine dance of Krishna and Radha to take place, if you want to create a container, a space um, in which she can start to move, in which she can start to
Mm.
breathe, in which her vibration can start to speak, right? And in my own small way, I'm seeking to create a container or a space in which people can feel something, actually feel something,
Mm.
actually feel the animate power of the cosmos moving, not just theoretically analyzing things, but feeling them
Yes.
move. Yeah.
I think I experienced this, Josh, when during the Sundarakandam reading of the text.
Mm.
Because, we all know the Ramayana, we all know about the story of Rama. But when you go to the Sundarakandam, you have so many descriptions of what Hanuman was in terms of just, his stride and his body, the dimensions, the scenery through which he had to traverse, which one does, even though we've all grown up in this culture, I have never had a sense of the landscape that actually, comes through in the original text. So,
Mm.
do you think that going back to original text is very important for this telling of the story in its most authentic form, and also the experience of the lived experience of the people, the living tradition? More
Yeah.
than through scholars, through scholarship.
Yeah. I mean, I think that going back to the original text is important. I think that chanting it and singing it is important. I think that, like you said, having somebody who a teacher who understands the fine points of it is important. I think all of that is important. It's not to say like I studied Sanskrit at various points in my life, but I'm not like a Sanskrit scholar, so I'm not reading every single Indian text in the full Sanskrit, right?
Mm,
But when I have studied the text in Sanskrit, there's a depth that I get out of it that is much deeper than when I study the text in English. Now, in English, some of the beauties still convey, and there are still aspects of it, but the cadence and the tone and the
mm,
rhythm of it, it's different. It changes. And a lot of the um, beauty, not just beauty, but a lot of the potency of the gods and goddesses transmits through tone and cadence and through meter. It transmits through these types of things. It's the same in the ancient Greek, like you understand Homer, and you understand that the
mm,
Iliad and the Odyssey were chanted and sung, um, and it's an entirely different experience than when it's chanted and sung, and it transmits in a very different way. Um, and I think that like those points in the texts too, and I think this is important, like that you're talking about those places in the text where it anchors it to what you could call rupa. It anchors it
mm,
to form. Like I said in the mindfulness episode, right? Form is important. Rupa is important. Those places, they're also the places that are most likely to be left out in
mm,
modern versions of those texts. And this has to do with I'd say the modern Western relationship with form. we like
mm,
we don't consider the local geographies, and I say we, I mean kind of generally speaking, like modern Western analysts. Like modern Western analysts don't consider the geographies and the colors and the textures and the rasas and the sat. We don't consider those to be the important part. We think the important part is like, oh well, what does it say about consciousness? You know, um,
mm,
not
mm.
realizing that the transmittive power of the text is through the rupa. It's the form through which it transmits, the vibrational form through which it transmits, if that makes sense. So the places where a text anchors us to geography or anchors us to a particular type of fruit or flower, in the tantric descriptions of the spanda, the pulse of consciousness, speaking of it as a kadamba bud. Well, I studied for many years, and for a while I just kind of took that as like, oh, that's a beautiful analogy to some type of flowering plant, And then one day I actually looked up the kadamba bud, the kadamba flower, and it is just this mystical architecture of nature. It's this spherical round bud, but it shoots out all of these brilliant white bristling projectiles. It looks like, the vibration of
Mm,
consciousness. It has that bristling, energetic, vibrant quality. Then you start to see, oh, like the patterns, the textures, you know, you can see this in Odisha a lot, where they use a lot of like jagged
mm,
patterns and jagged textures. Like the patterns, the textures, the shape of the plant, all of these things are actually important. None of
mm,
these are there by accident. These are located in a living understanding of ecology and geography, that transmits energy when we understand what these references are and what they're actually. And again, the same is true in the ancient Greek traditions. The plant references in the ancient Greek traditions, none of those plants are there by
mm,
accident. They're not referencing them by accident. There are reasons why um, the plants that are sacred within the Indian tradition are sacred. There are medicinal reasons, but it goes beyond that too. There are reasons in terms of their shape and architecture, and all of this is aesthetic. All of this is concerned with rupa, with form. Yeah.
So two other things that are connected to form, Josh, which are almost now eliminated or sanitized. One is blood, which you mentioned repeatedly. The other is sensuality or sexuality.
Mm,
So, in my visit to two places, one was Udupi and one was Anantapur in Andhra Pradesh. In Andhra Pradesh, there was a shrine where every time a bulldozer came to demolish the temple, there would be, snakes would come out and chase away those people.
mm,
And in Udupi, on the main road, there was like a spate of accidents when the sacrifices stopped. As
mm,
soon as they resumed the sacrifice, everything went back to normal.
mm,
So the locals understand this, but in the larger Indian context, we have, and in our minds too, we have removed these two things. One is, of course, sacrifice is now banned in most places. Other is the goddess is so closely associated with sensuality, and I'm reading the biography of the founder of Devi Puram, and
mm,
he played a very big role in trying to bring back this identity of the goddess. So what do you think, in the modern context, how do we re-emphasize these two aspects of the goddess?
mm. Yeah. So I've been fortunate enough to have been to Kamakya Devi Temple a few times. And at Kamakya Devi Temple, there's still sacrifice. Um, a lot. There's a lot of sacrifice. And, it's a full-blown tantric temple. In other words, if you start looking around at the art, you are going to see birth and death and sex and menstruation and virginity and all of it, right? Um, every phase of the cycle of life is her domain, right? Every phase of the goddess's cycle of life is her domain, right? So she's not just in the kind of experiences of bodilessness, she is also in the experience of being embodied. She is present in her virginal and unbroken aspects, and then she is also present as the mother, right? And she is present as the crone in the image of Dumavati and other aspects. Understanding, you know, all of this is associated with like the red bindu, with red, with the color of life, with blood. You have this incredible image at Tarapith Temple in Bengal of Ma Tara, and from her nose down, from up here is all you know white bindu, all up here, like in her forehead and her crown is all white, and then from her nose down is blood red, like a lion who's been feeding. She's the cycle of life, she's the blood cycle, she's the she the vibrant blood energy that is the blood of the color of longing, and is the color of consummation and the color of birth. And right, she is this. And the priests are dressed in red at Kamakya Devi, and red is associated with the goddess for her associations with life. And I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know, right? Um,
Yeah, fine.
you know, within that, um, you know, I like when I grew up in a household that was fairly vegetarian, and they had adopted those aspects of, you know, Indian tradition, and I have a deep love for animals and a deep respect for, Indian vegetarianism. Um, and then I also came when I went to Kamakya Devi to really deeply feel and understand the importance of sacrifice and the importance of offering and the special place that blood holds for the goddess. Um, in fact, and there in a lot of offerings in other places, there's kind of like a substitution for blood, right? There's kind of like a modern substitution. Um, the blood reminds us, though, that this is the cycle of life. This is the cycle of existence. um you know she, in many traditional visions, like she She feeds on blood. She births us. She's the mother of us all. She brings us into this world kindly and tenderly, you know, and she's also associated with the full cycle of life, which includes death and which includes feeding, right? And feeding is a huge part of this cycle. At any Indian temple and any tradition on any given day, there's going to be fruit offered and food offered, and there's going to be prasad taken. You know, the I think the original substrate historically from which this comes, if you look at global tradition, is a substrate of sacrifice. There's the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is the renewal of life. And one thing dies so that other things might live. This is in the story of Chinnamasta herself, the goddess, as she's, returning home after a hard day of slaying demons, and her attendants are hungry, and they say, "Ma, we're hungry," and she doesn't have anything to feed them, so she takes her own head, and they feast off the spouts of blood that come from her neck. This is, this is a holistic vision of nature, right? Like, to have your vision of nature just be this kind of removed, detached vision. No, she's present in the cycles of life. So present that she's the mother that would give her own body in order to feed her children, right? She's ever present in the cycles of life, and she needs to be honored through the cycles of life. And I found that to witness sacrifice in all of its paradox, there's a violence to it, because there's a violence to life, but there's also a tenderness and a love to it. And the animals are, garlanded in flowers, and, they're honored even as their life is taken. And then what happens to that animal's body is that animal's body becomes meat, and it goes to feed people. And the goddess drinks the blood, and there's the renewal of life. This, the discomfort I felt around the violence of it, but combined with the beauty of it. And it really just took me to this place where I felt, this is who she is. Like, I don't know if I can actually know who she is fully without being able to look deeply into this part of who she is too. And it's not as simple as like, oh, well, it's okay to just kind of sanitize that and, have it be some kind of representation for, the full experience of existence. The full experience of life is the experience of sacrifice, feeding, like birthing, dying. This is it. And if we want to fully honor and encapsulate who she is, then that may involve sacrifice as well. And, for those who haven't actually experienced it and have a lot of maybe like Hollywood or, Bollywood visions of what, that actually looks like, to see the complexity of it, the paradox of it, the gentleness and the brutality all at once, it's not what you think it's going to be. We have this, maybe, I know in the West anyway, we have this like vision of what like animal sacrifice is, and it looks like very brutal. And meanwhile in the West, we sacrifice millions and millions and millions of animals every day in the modern meat industry, and without any type of sacred recognition at all, right? But it's not what you think it is. It's far more tender, and it's transportive. There's a power to it. There's no doubt about it that there's a power to it. To walk into like the womb of Kamakya Devi temple, like down into the deep dark spaces, and there's flowers everywhere, red flowers everywhere, red hibiscus, and then there's buffalo heads. Like, it stirs something very, very deep and very primordial within the human being. And it's all, it's not like meant to be frightening, or it's offering, it's food, it's the cycle of life, it's continuity. All of that's in the story of Durga and Mahishasura too. It's like, this is the sacrifice, and the earth receives the blood, and then the earth returns with her bounty and with her, new cycle of crops and growth. And it's been this way for traditions around the world for centuries and centuries and centuries. Yeah, and as I realized, I talked for a while and I only answered half your question, but you know,
I'll just take a few more minutes if it's okay.
yeah, sure, absolutely. The
What?
you know, well,
Sorry.
on the this is, and it's related to the um sensuality, sexuality piece, and I think this is something, I don't know if I'm going to be able to say anything to this that is going to be new or enlightening for Indian listeners. I feel like there is um a real stirring of the Shakti within India around this. And, you know, whether that takes the form of, some kind of like sexual revolution like it did in the West, or whether it takes the form of, um, you know, changing certain society, sociocultural structures. Um, I feel that there's a lot stirring around this particular topic within India. And I've seen at Kamakya, I've seen, people from India going there and having it be kind of a reclamation of like a sensuality and sexuality. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition within Indian tradition because, you can say on the one hand that there's like a conservative aspect to Indian tradition. And then you start looking around at all the temples and it is so sensual and explicit, and the full cycle of life and the celebration of the full cycle of life, and how that latent sensuality that exists like barely even under the surface interplays with the larger social structure, I think is a story that is not yet done being told. Let's put it that way. I think it's an evolving story.
One thing which startled me in Kamakya, Josh, was at the sacrifice place was after the sacrifice, after the head was decapitated, the body still twitched
Mm,
of the good. So to me, it was like this life, even though the animal is technically not living, it's still living.
mm,
Which was very strange because in my head, it was like when you sacrifice, when you cut off the head, then the creature is dead.
mm,
But probably this idea of, to the next question, I'll keep it as the last question. But personally, since you've been into the various darshanas and into Tantra, where does this, I mean, even your podcast on mindfulness and meditation, is there an end point in terms of awareness and where we are all heading? We have the progressive path, we have the direct path. When we listen to the people who talk about the direct path, we are so convinced that that's absolutely it. And
mm,
then when we talk about the progressive path, we think, yes, this is definitely so convincing. So, and both are equally attractive, and both, I think, in some capacity, I've experienced something powerful in both traditions.
mm,
So, what is, in terms of what the work that you do and your life experiences, what is it that we are all moving toward? Is it what they all talk about, the consciousness and stepping away, stepping back, and looking at all this in a, in terms of not being the not ending at death,
mm,
and being, a consciousness that is eternal and one with the rest of the world?
mm,
So how do these different traditions take us there?
mm. The small
And
questions, right?
you also have, Josh, you have dualism. We have, this. We have the Advaitans. We'll have our other darshanas. So how do we, for a non-Indian? I mean,
Mm.
there's so much on offer. It's like a thali with so many dishes. What do they do? Are we confusing them? How do they actually go forward?
Yeah. I mean, really, ultimately, from my experience, the main thing to do is practice. And Sri Ramakrishna went through the phase of his life where he practiced, and various traditions. And what he found ultimately, he went from being a Kali worshiper, he practiced Islam for a while, he practiced Christianity, and he found that they led to the same place. So that, getting hung up on like the fine points of like, is it one or is it two? Is it qualified non-dualism or is it, that's less important, because I've studied with Srila Sadhu Maharaj in Vrindavan, and who's coming from a Dvaita, Bhakti Dvaita perspective, and I've studied with, non-dual tantric teachers, and the fine points of arguing about the nature of the universe are less important than in doing the practice, and showing up day in and day out and doing the practice. And what you find from these two schools, very different in certain ways, schools of thought and approaches and all this kind of thing, but you find that the people who've been practicing for years and years and years, they tend to be patient, they tend to be gentle, they tend to be loving. They tend to be able to be vessels for the divine to move through, for the animate to move through. So it's funny sometimes. I mean, I'm going to do an episode where I talk about this because, I mean, it's thanks to India that we can have these kind of, deep, profound discussions about, is it all one, is it all two? And, clearly it's both. It's both. It is one and it is two. And there are times when it can be really helpful to relate to the immediacy of it. And there's times when it can be really helpful to relate to the transcendent. It's important to relate to the transcendent just as it's important to relate to the immanent. There's times when it's important to feel it like, as this great continuum of which I'm a part. There's also times the Bhakti traditions have instilled in me, there's a beauty to feeling separate and a necessity of feeling separate. And when we feel separate from the divine, we can sing our way back to the divine and feel close again. And this is the beauty of the Dvaita traditions too. So I have never viewed Indian tradition as, one is absolutely right and the others are false, and even the like kind of, at certain points in Indian tradition, the like poking that they did at each other, like, a lot of that is coming out of deep respect and recognition of, those schools, and not out of a sense of like, my school's right. And, for a non-dualist to say my school's right and your school's wrong is not very non-dual. Right. So, I think that there are, many ways to view the cosmos and our journey within the cosmos and where we're headed, and what it's all leading to and what it's all for. I mean, I have the heart, I would say, of a Bhaktin in that I love singing of and feeling the separation. I love feeling the distance and longing for the return. And then cosmologically, I have always loved the tantric traditions and the understanding that, um, the divine mother is the primal vibration of consciousness that self-reflects, and in self-reflecting manifests into all the various diversity and intricacy of the individual jivas like waves on the ocean, and that those jivas through their long meandering spiraling journey find their way back to that great consciousness over lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes. I feel this to be a reflection of how nature works. And then I feel that as soon as that absorption happens, there's there's a reemergence again, and the journey of the jivas will start all over again, and we'll be, in another multi-trillion year spiral. And, the best we can do is imbue our lives with sacredness. Like the best we can do is pause and honor this movement of spirit. This life will be over before we know it. Before we know it, we'll be ashes, right? And in the time that we have, to see every phase of her cycles as sacred and honor every phase as we go, I think, this is what I feel called to do anyway.
That's so beautiful, and I'm totally with you. And in the Jagannath Puri shrine, as you might know, Josh, is the prasad is prasad when it's offered to Sri Krishna, but when they take it back and offer it to her, it becomes Mahaprasad. So
Mm,
finally, so finally, she's the one who's above everything. I think
mm,
so.
mm.
Such a beautiful conversation. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
wonderful. Thanks for having
Yeah,
me, and really appreciate the questions, and happy to talk again sometime too.
yeah, Josh. And looking forward to you visiting India sometime.
Yeah, I'll let you
Yeah.
know the next time my family comes back.